Does the public have accurate information on the dangers of chemicals, pesticides, toxic chemicals, and wireless radiation? Why or why not?
Well, my experience is no, because even as a seasoned physician, maybe even 10 years ago, who had gone through med school, gone through residency, had been a clinical doctor for at least about 7 to 10 years, I didn't even know that there's such poor regulation in the US consumer market that chemicals are not required to be tested before they go to the market. And we love our stuff. So unfortunately, I think people don't realize that the stuff they love potentially could cause them health issues. And I'm a big proponent of getting that information out there and teaching people about the regulatory downfalls and pitfalls and lack thereof, and also to teach them how to make better choices, knowing which chemicals potentially could cause harm in which products.
You said we have had 90,000 chemicals added to our world over the last 200 years. Should we be concerned about this? Are they affecting our health or disease? Is there any proof that these 90,000 chemicals create disease? How are our kids affected by this?
Yeah, so this is a wonderful question. So I think people first have to understand that there are that many chemicals that are now allowable in our products. That's the first thing. Since the 1950s, these numbers have exploded. And again, because our legislation and our regulations are so limited, they don't require manufacturers in the US to test these chemicals for safety, toxicity, and especially in very vulnerable populations such as pregnant women, children, and those with autoimmune diseases. And so the issue really becomes, once we know that, how can this really, in a big picture, how can this be good for us from an anthropology perspective? Anthropology has shaped almost everything I do in medicine. I don't think we just plunked right down here and started living with nice cologne and fancy shoes. We've evolved millions of years to manage a lot of our outside exposures. But when we get 200 years of 90,000 chemicals in food, in water, in air quality, in feminine care products, and lay on even additionally radiation exposure, stress, poor sleep, when we start to layer on these exposures, what I call environmental health, you can see that the human body is actually not genetically or environment or evolutionarily prepared for all of this so close in history. And so I do want people to step back, think about this. Now, individually, these chemicals do in fact cause health issues. I would say cause, but also associated more likely because we have confounders. And there's no question there's over 800 to 1,000 known endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs as they're called, that actually disrupt the normal functioning of hormones in the human body. These have been touted, studied, and written about, published internationally, World Health Organization, American Academy of Pediatrics, Endocrine Society. And so we do know that there are in fact health connections, associations to exposures, and that has been well vetted and robust in the literature. We can go into specifics as we go through this interview, but I do want people to know that we do have third-party testing, university level, international study testing from NGOs and not manufacturing to definitely show that there are associations between our environmental chemicals, many of them, many of them, and human health issues.
Why do we need to talk about chemicals, toxins, or dangerous substances in our food, air, water, and soil? Aren't there government agencies making sure that everything is safe and healthy for me?
Well, we have government agencies that back in the 1938, the Federal Drug and Cosmetic Act, also the FDA and the EPA that do a certain degree of oversight, do have some oversight. But the problem is that there are too many chemicals and not enough of the actual required testing. We've opened the floodgates to manufacturing and free trade and proprietary secrets of fragrance. The word fragrance can have up to 300 or more chemicals that are not required to be disclosed or transparent to the consumer. And we've really based most of our regulatory we really don't have very much regulation anymore, even on food chemicals. We've really let the manufacturers run wild. And that's because of their kind of, they've got their claws on, between lobbyists and, the heavy cost of the food industry. They're not required to actually, monitor themselves, similar to, or I should say insimilar to Europe, where they have much more rigorous vetting for the chemicals that go into their food and their cosmetics. And in fact, we have companies that actually create different recipes or different manufacturing components for shampoo or conditioner or different cosmetics cleaning products that we allow, but Europe does not. Same company. So, it's been a letdown. We've had some regulatory oversight back in the 1950s, and 1938 actually is when it began, and then 1950s. But since that time, food is now considered generally regarded as safe, as the most stringent form of oversight, which is really saying, okay, manufacturers, tell us what you think if it's safe. So clearly they're biased in their design to get these chemicals into their products. So the answer is TSCA, which is another regulatory bill that was supposed to go through when Lautenberg was still alive, that fell flat. And now we are really just without great legislation to manufacture, to require these this kind of testing.
Are there any chemicals or toxins of any type in my drinking water? And do I need to be concerned about this?
So it's interesting, I've been doing this now almost 9 or 10 years. And really, I started off, eating Cheez Whiz and Oreos. And, I really was not in a place where chemicals was even on my radar. The only reason I got into this, and some people may know this story from the book that I just published, it's all in the introduction of my journey, is that my dog got ill. And when my dog got really sick and developed autoimmune hepatitis, which is actually interesting because I'm an autoimmune disease specialist for humans, unfortunately, it's so rare in dogs, and particularly golden retrievers, that I was just so dumbfounded. I started researching what made him sick, whether it was his drinking water contaminated. We live in New Jersey, with lots of pesticides. We're the garden state, right? And I looked at his food quality, and I looked at, anything, his flea and tick collar, his plastic toy in his mouth. And, this journey has been a long one, but it has been based on evidence that I have gathered. It's built a repertoire of what's truth. And one of the things that has stood out beyond any other topic, at least in terms of kind of shouting on mountaintops, is drinking water. And I think people don't realize how dirty American drinking water is. And this is actually the number one talk I give nationally to programs. Because when you get to the down and dirty, the one law, Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, requires only 91 chemicals to be studied, monitored, and remediated at the over 160,000 water treatment plants in the US. That one law still holds in 2021. It is the 1974 Safe Drinking Water Act. I suggest people look it up, because this is one of those things that really blew my mind. And those 160,000 water treatment plants, our city water, serves about 75 to 80% of the US population. The other 20% really comes from wells. And wells don't require any testing at any time unless you have to sell the property. So people sit on wells and never get it tested, and yet soil and chemicals for manufacturing and runoff and sewage and coal ash and fracking will make their way through soil into the areas where wells, serving homes, serving schools, rural populations really are the main source of their drinking water. So the number one thing I always talk about, and what I shout on mountaintops, is please try to filter your drinking water. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Don't bother testing it if you don't want to spend the money on that. Spend the money on a $300 reverse osmosis water filter that's well vetted and certified, that has a carbon component. These are not expensive anymore, and anyone really can afford them. So that's what I say. It could be carbon filter, which is a pitcher, a faucet. It could be your refrigerator door. It can be always all the way up to an extreme, aggressive form of cleaning water, which I agree with is reverse osmosis. But any type of filtration to me is a good effort. And it's especially important in young people who have a smaller body mass index. So their volume of water, even compared to an adult, is much higher than us.
Are there any diseases that have gone up in the last 50 years that you believe correlate with environmental toxins and chemicals?
Absolutely. And this has been well studied from the epidemiology literature, but I'm a rheumatologist. I will tell you clinically, I would say this, even without looking at the actual research numbers, that we are seeing not only more autoimmune disease, we are seeing it in younger people. We are seeing not only more cancers, We are seeing it in younger people, especially thyroid cancer, which is highly associated with environmental chemicals. I'm seeing patients on thyroid medication, even if it's not cancers. They are on young people on thyroid medication, which normally was, you would think, reserved for postmenopausal women with some thyroid abnormalities occasionally. But what, it's now 10% of the U.S. population has some type of autoimmune disease, which is not because we're getting better at diagnosing it. It's because it's just more common. And we're talking MS, all the rheumatology issues like, rheumatoid, lupus, polymyalgia, rheumatica, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, some of the GI autoimmune diseases. And so we really are at a point where I got so frustrated in my own career of handing out medications only. And I'm not against meds, but only as my only tool, that I actually trained with Dr. Andrew Weil and his Integrative Medicine program that's run with wonderful MD PhDs, evidence-based program, 2 years, board certified, like the real deal, because I was just so frustrated with the tools that I had. And now I have more tools. I have better ways of evaluating environmental health conditions. I ask people in environmental health history. And so all of these really do play out into human health and what we can prevent and what we can treat. And when you have all of these tools, medicines plus an integrative approach, you can really, help people, I think, the most. And that's what I've seen with my practice and, as I go through with my journey in difficult patients.
How did the industrial machine of companies like Monsanto evolve from the war effort to production of commercial goods?
Well, very interesting. In the 1950s, and even The Graduate, the movie, right, going into plastics, that was where to go. And in fact, that was true. I mean, that was an exploding industry. We had naugahyde and rayon and, formica and plexiglass and, food storage changed dramatically, which was a good thing, right? Instead of using natural resources like wood and I'm trying to think of other forms that they used to use, but essentially, you could have an aluminum can that was lined with bisphenol A plastic, and you could store food in a can and send it overseas in World War II to soldiers, and you would be able to keep that food safe. And so there was good intention, I believe. Back in the 1950s, it was very exciting to have all different types of plastics. But that was also the time that they were also coming up with pesticides and insecticides and ways to protect troops overseas as well from malaria and a lot of infectious issues. What happened, though, is that floodgate opened and, plastics started to be used for everything. Dishes and packaging and then we start, because basically what happened was this even BPA is one of the first ones where they actually are basically epoxy resins or these compounds that are kind of connected and interlocked. And you can have clear plastic. That was from Bayer back many years ago. That's how they started having clear plastics. The problem is that now we know that they aren't solid materials, and those monomers, those epoxy resin compounds, actually leach, break apart. And that's how we're getting it into our food containers, and from food containers into our food. That's how we're getting BPA getting into our food as well. So all canned foods get exposure. People get exposure to BPA. And so again, a great idea, perhaps, very marketable, exciting for usable materials, right? But we didn't think about also the downstream waste issues and how we break these components down. So there was no full picture of how these are created and then how they are broken down safely and not affecting our environment, which gets into our water and gets into our food. So it's one big cycle that wasn't truly thought out. So I'm hoping that now we have green chemistry. We have people that are working on wonderful solutions for food packaging composition, for food storage, for cosmetic chemicals. And so this is becoming a big area, and I'm very hopeful about it.
How do we clean our house without using toxic chemicals?
What we wanted to do is we wanted to break up this book into chapters. Drinking water is one, cosmetics and personal care products is another, cleaning products is another, and really just take bite-sized pieces so you can really understand the whole story. What was important to us was to really give people options, not just How do you look up a product online and what are the vetted resources to see which ones are safer products in terms of chemicals that we now know are harmful versus others. I wanted people to be able to make your own cleaning products. And really, it's going back to the basics. It's what our grandmothers used. I hate to be sexist, but it's true. We want to use white vinegar. We want to use sea salt or kosher sea salt, which is a larger grain for scrubbing. We want to use baking soda, borax. You really want to go back to lemon juice, lemon oils that are not synthetic. It doesn't take much. And I think that when we put those recipes, those do-it-yourself recipes for cleaning products, we also did it for personal care products, and I also did it for foods that are very detoxing and healthy for the body. I think when you're allowed to have that choice of purchasing and choosing well versus do-it-yourself, I think it opens up the possibilities of really getting this process of reducing exposures to harmful chemicals. It gives you a lot of options.
Is my indoor air okay to breathe? Can it get me sick?
Yeah, well, we're now seeing that certainly outdoor air pollution is linked to a whole list of health concerns, not just asthma, which is sort of an acute issue, but also COPD and emphysema exacerbation, also depression and anxiety associated. And so we know that's outdoor air pollution, which you can't always control. You can't always pick up and move your city where you live or you work. So what I love to talk about, and we do this in the chapter on air quality, is really talk about what you can control. Okay, like the Serenity Prayer, which is in the first couple of pages. Let's figure out what we can control and work on that stuff. And then we can manage sort of outdoor air as best we can in terms of a filter in your car if you're commuting, and that's possible as well. Indoor air is mostly what we do to ourselves. And I had to learn this myself. I had a whole drawer of plug-in liquid synthetic chemicals with bay breeze and ocean, ocean smell and, raspberry and pumpkin and the holidays. We are marketed a bunch of junk. And I didn't know this because I had a whole drawer of these when I tossed them all. And in fact, again, phthalates is a group of compounds. There's hundreds of them that are actually used to create fragrance. They keep the fragrance lasting longer, so a longer shelf time, but they are known endocrine disruptors, many of them. The work of Shauna Swan is remarkable. She just came out with a recent book about infertility related to phthalate exposures in babies and pregnant women. So, this work has been going on for 30 years on phthalates, incredible papers, incredible international work, and a known issue. And again, they're used often, not limited to, fragrances. So the first thing I want people to think of is get rid of things that you bring into your own home, that you bring into your own life. Get rid of cleaning products and carpet powders and laundry detergents that have fragrance. Really go with the slim down, less is more approach, and you'll save money. And you'll also reduce those exposures because in our airtight homes, we keep all those chemicals in. If you open your windows, that's better. If you get rid of carpeting that holds on to these chemicals, if you clean more dust, which has been shown to hold a lot of these chemicals, not just phthalates, but flame retardant chemicals and BPA. So there's a lot we can do. And I actually wanted people to know, I hate cleaning myself, but I do it, and dust is one of the key issues. But I want people to just know this is about a practical journey of doing what you can in a way that literally just makes sense. And that was the goal of that chapter and the book.
Is the government or EPA, FDA, FCC, or any government agencies doing anything to protect us from chemicals, pesticides, heavy metals, toxins, and wireless radiation?
Well, that's a big question to bite off, but I will tell you this. Dr. Von Saal, who has been fighting the good fight on Capitol Hill through his research, he is a fearless warrior. He is a salaried, academic. This is a lot of what he put into his chapter on the history of regulation of chemicals in this country. And then in our chapter that we did on radiation, we specifically called out radiation, not only the history, but the health related issues, the known, associations in terms of health risks through great studies that have even been run through the National Toxicology Program that the United States runs. But we have work from Israel and Germany and France, and they're actually limiting 5G And we talk about what is 3G, 4G, 5G. I mean, I was like, well, what is that? Why do we all walk around talking about 5G as being such a great thing when we really don't even understand what that is? And so we wanted people to have the C-spot run of this topic and what these words mean and what it means in terms of moving forward. Our technology is moving again faster, similar to chemicals, than our regulations can keep up with, or I should say even the science is paid for to look at. Who pays for these? If it's not the government with their, with the money that we have, then it has to be third-party academic institutions that can have the money to do this potentially. But they're fighting for dollars as well. So, we're really left in this lurch where we're pushing out stuff that seems cool, but we don't look downstream to potential health issues. And when we do dig them up, it's very hard to pull those chemicals, that radiation rules and regulations, 5G, out of the market once people are very comfortable and happy with these things.
Please elaborate on this quote from your website. I believe that the human body is truly amazing. Our bodies have evolved over 2.5 million years to fight off infection, think, feel, break down food, detoxify harmful substances, and create life, a series of evolutionary miracles built on our ever-changing environment. Within the past 200 years, the human mind and imagination has brought forth more change than ever before in history. The industrial and technological revolutions have transformed the human experience and way of life into a fast-paced world of technology, chemical production, and greater convenience. We've not been able to appropriately evolve on the evolutionary timeline as fast as our surroundings have changed. The polluted air, food additives, toxins, and emotional stressors, to name a few, have had a negative impact on our bodies. We are human and we break.
Yeah. I really do believe all of that. And, it comes from a place, again, of frustration where I'm seeing sicker and younger people. And it's just one of those things where when the data supports what I'm saying, it took me 10 years to really feel confident enough to know that what I'm saying is true and has evidence and supported by really smart people that do this for a living. And it's not just one small faction or one group or one institution. This is a big deal. The World Health Organization's 2012 report on endocrine disrupting chemicals is about this thick. And I actually used to take it to lectures and put 3 copies around the room to show them I didn't make this stuff up, that this is out there. It's just not getting to you. No one is paying for a good commercial on this to get it to you. They're paying for, synthetic cereals in the morning for your kids to eat. And, I don't feel judgy. I've been through this myself with my kids. Like I said, I grew up on Cheese Whiz, Oreos, and Diet Dr. Pepper and thought that it was his own food group. And it was my journey to get away from these things as I learned. And so I don't judge. I color my hair. I keep going. But people have to do this for what makes them feel comfortable. That phrase really sums up, my history of anthropology study. I think we need to really sit back and understand what we're doing to ourselves. And then environment and environmental health is not just what we think of as chemicals. It really is a variety of exposures that are not really consistent with our genetic template. And that noise pollution has been, and I have a section in the book on noise pollution, which I think is fascinating. People living near airports having a higher risk of heart disease and stroke just from the stress of the noise, and what to do about it, all the different ways to decrease noise pollution if you live in a city or a place where there's a lot of activity. But, noise pollution, synthetic light has been shown to be an interesting exposure. Stress, certainly we can all relate to, especially now. But then we see the more obvious things like chemicals in food and stuff like that. But radiation is something people don't think about. I mean, if I tell you I walk through my kids' school and more kids are using laptops on their lap over their vulnerable genitalia, I mean, it's shocking to me because that is radiation directly to that location, even if it doesn't get that hot, as computers get hot. We really need to think about location and distance of these tech toys from our physical body. I mean, I have 2 boys and they have cell phones. And I'll tell you, if they put their phone in their pocket, I say, I want to be a grandmother one day. What are you doing? So they're now at the point where they turn on airplane mode of their phone. It's away from their heads at night when they're charging. They never put it in their front pockets. They keep their laptops away from their groin. I mean, these are like the little things, and now they do it on their own. So I think it's just a matter of being aware, understanding why, and then just putting into some very practical changes.
A chapter in your book is titled How the Human Endocrine and Immune Systems Are Disrupted by Chemical Exposures. Please tell us more about what that's about.
So this is a really an interesting phenomenon. We know we have a lot of data from the endocrine disrupting research world, okay, that was started by Theo Colburn. Many people may have read Our Stolen Future that was supported by Al Gore. This is about 15, 20 years ago. So that was sort of the first inkling. It was almost by haphazard discovery that they discovered that plastics are capable of being endocrine disruptors, particularly mimicking estrogen. I believe it was a study where they were looking at estrogen levels in mice, and they didn't realize that the water feeder, which was made of plastic, was contributing to the changes in the results. And that was an eye-opening study, which I wish I had more detail, but I can't remember entirely. But that started this whole concept of our plastics contributing something that's changing hormones, and that exploded. So we have plenty of good information worldwide on different classes of endocrine disruptors. There are pesticides, there are solvents that are used in industry, there are glues, epoxy resins. We certainly know food additive chemicals can disrupt hormones. And metals, certain metals can actually do that as well. Methyl mercury has been shown to be an endocrine disruptor. So that's an interesting phenomenon. But how these chemicals also affect the immune system is an area of study that has not been well looked into. And I'm actually doing that now for a new book. And I think understanding how diseases, of the immune system, I mean, the body is not completely siloed, right? They talk to each other, these systems. But how and what they say to each other is very interesting, and where environmental stressors and chemicals come in to disrupt those systems is what I find truly fascinating. Because once you figure out why, you can figure out what to do about it. And so really, because it's so complicated, both of them, it's hard to go into this in detail, but I will say this: endocrine disruption is named such because it's not just mimicking estrogen at low levels, which of course you don't want more estrogens, because that basically can lead to higher rates of breast cancer, which we now know is related to endocrine disruption and these chemicals. But it also can affect fertility and all of the hormone sensitive cancers: prostate, breast, uterine, endometrial, thyroid. It can affect the receptors, whether the receptors go down in number. There's many mechanisms by which they disrupt. And so, not all chemicals work the same way, but they do have this endpoint of disruption.
Should we fill our indoor space with plants to clean the air?
That is one component, absolutely. And we give a list of the most well-tested. Actually, NASA did a great study on this as well, which we put in the book. But we have a lot of interesting information from Indian studies, because they have a very high amount of air pollution in India, certainly China as well. And we listed a lot of the plants that have been well studied. The only issue with plants that we have to keep in mind is if you're just doing that and not removing the sources of other contaminants, you're sort of wasting your time. You want to get rid of your cleaning products that are leaving residues on your offices, your home, because they will stay there after they've been sprayed and wiped, and they will aerate off into the air. They'll end up in the dust. Your kids will put them in their mouths. Your pets will have them on their paws. And so you have to look at it as more of, what do you take away? And then what do you add to add value? And so plants are very important. Even their surface area of their leaves collect chemicals, which you can wipe off. And in addition, you really have to have a high volume of those plants to really make a difference. You can't just have one little plant in the corner of a big, huge, 5,000 square foot space. So we talk about that, and we want people to just have a realistic concept, but really know that plants are fabulous for mental health. We know nature is really critical. But really, you can't just do one thing without thinking about some of the other components that add harmful chemicals.
You've talked about wireless radiation from cell phones and Wi-Fi and laptops and other gadgets. Can you tell us anything more about the risk and how we can protect ourselves from this?
Yeah, I mean, so the way radiation works, or EMF, electromagnetic radiation, is essentially it's radio waves. And we have a whole spectrum of radio waves, and some of which are used in X-ray technology and CAT scans, all the way to radio waves, where you wouldn't expect to turn on your radio and listen to music and get radiation exposure, because those are wavelengths that have not been considered harmful in any way. Then there's sort of this middle of the road wavelength that's really microwave wavelength. And so that's the area where most of these cell phones and technology are in, is in that range. And that has been considered to be harmful because we now have studies that show that exposure to that level of radio wave close to the body creates heat. It's about signaling to cell phone towers. It's basically, I believe, 90 clicks per second. I mean, that's the kind of cellular connection there goes on. So when you hit, airplane mode, you're cutting off that connection. So I do recommend that quite a bit when you're not using your phone or sleeping. But what's interesting is that microwave sort of spectrum, and I have it in the book, and I'm going to see if I can find it, because I want people to understand that, microwaves work fine, and you shouldn't be afraid of your microwave itself, because it's in a box, typically called a Faraday box, which means it's a closed, protected, sealed space. So it's okay to have microwaves heating your food. Technically, I mean, it may break down nutritional components, but it's not going to hurt you. But it's sealed, it's blocked. We are essentially now living in our own microwave because we don't have protection from it. And so if you kind of step back, you understand that we have waves running all the time with all these cell phone towers and Wi-Fi running 24 hours a day. So this is what I wanted to show you, but I don't know if it's backwards, but essentially we have electromagnetic radiation. And this is a picture, an image kind of showing, what we use it for, which tech toys we use it for, and why we use it, and what the ranges are. And I think that's a really good perspective, because again, not everything is going to harm us or kill us or give us trouble. But what we do know about certain wavelengths, we can actually reduce those exposures in very simple, practical ways.
What about our lawn care and the chemicals they apply to it that are designed to kill? Should we be concerned about insecticides, herbicides, and pesticides?
Yeah, I think you just named my chapter. Let me just see what it was called. It was called Insecticides, Herbicides, and Other Pesticides, chemicals designed to kill. Yeah, sides. Yep. So, these things were designed to kill things. We're afraid of bugs. We're afraid of bacteria. We're afraid of viruses. We're afraid of a lot. And a lot of that is marketing, because we do know that many of those, bacteria and viruses that are in our world actually help our immune system, bolster it, are part of our GI tract without any clinical or problematic problems. But we have such an enormous amount of, we have, I think, over 3,000 pesticides that are now allowable in the market. Again, most have not been tested for safety or toxicity. Some have been removed from the market, like chlorpyrifos. We know glyphosate has a whole host of problems. That's pretty pervasive. The thing is, we've gotten good at creating these chemicals. And we've made companies very rich at doing so. And the idea that we need them is turning out to be a falsehood in order to create food sources. That we really need to think about regenerative farming and ways to clean up our soil so it's not nutrient depleted. Many of these chemicals, like glyphosate, need to be sprayed multiple times. They're desiccants to dry out the crop, but they're also used as an herbicide, most widely used herbicide nationally and even internationally in some countries, although it's changing rapidly. But they have to be applied more so now, because many of the weeds they're designed to kill are actually becoming resistant, and they're growing in more plentitude and more aggressively. So they need multiple sprayings. So now we have a bad chemical being sprayed once, which is bad enough, but now multiple sprayings because of this kind of cycle. The other thing is, farmers are really held to use the seeds that are paired to these pesticides. I mean, that's the new shtick, right? Is that they create the pesticide and then they create the seeds genetically that will withstand that pesticide. And farmers are obligated to use these seeds, and it's very hard for them to get away from Monsanto, who runs the gamut of this industry, and to use seeds that are not genetically engineered. So we have a real problem also, because we need to feed our farmers, and our farmers are not necessarily on board, but they have no choice. And so that's a real social and economic issue that I think needs to be addressed. There are ways to do this without pesticides. There's a program even that we talk about in the book called Beyond Pesticides, which is a Washington, D.C. nonprofit. And they have an enormous number of resources for farmers to change over. And I'm actually working with our local farmer, trying to work with him to change over. He's like 95 years old and he's willing to learn. So there's always hope.
What actions can I take to protect me from chemicals in antiperspirant and personal care products?
Well, the first thing I would say is there's lots of things, but first thing is the less is more approach, whether it's cleaning products, whether it's, industrial chemicals you have in the garage or in your home. The less is more approach, going back to a place where we don't need a specific cleaner for a doorknob versus a wall versus a glass window. I mean, we've been so specialized. It's almost like in medicine where you need to go to a finger doctor and a nose doctor and an elbow doctor. It's like we've become so specialized that we forget to see the whole. Many of the safest cleaners and the safest cosmetics don't require a lot of ingredients to do their job. And I think when people realize that, they're going to start to understand why certain beauty companies are really exploding, because they understand that concept and they're moving in that direction and the market is following them. So I think the first thing is remove stuff you don't need. Second thing is look up cosmetics, personal care products, cleaning products on vetted websites like Environmental Working Group, ewg.org. We call out a lot to them in this book, but there's other resources as well. And, really vetting out which products you put in, on, and around your body. As a note, I teach high school, I teach college. I want young people to understand this stuff because teenagers use the most personal care products daily than any other demographic, 15 to 17 products daily versus women who use 12. And of course, men use 6. Maybe should use more. But anyway, the idea is that the people who are most hormonally challenged, teenagers who use the most products daily, should really be using the safest products. So that is a demographic I am working very hard to get this curricula into schools and high schools. But yeah, once you know what's in the products or what the alternatives are, and there are many, it's really empowering and very, very exciting for people to be conscious of what they control over their bodies.
What actions can I take to protect myself from chemicals in medication?
So first, understanding a little bit about medication. Not all medications are helpful. I mean, as many of us know, but many of them are life-saving. And I use quite a few of them in my practice as a rheumatologist for lupus nephritis and rheumatoid arthritis. I use all these biologics and, what have you. Thank God they exist because they do wonderful things for quality of life. The question always is do these drugs need to be used right away and reflexively? Now, in an acute situation of someone severely ill, of course, you don't think about kumbaya and some fish oil, but, there are tools that we have that can work in many similar ways to many of the conventional medications with far fewer side effects. And that's really what integrative medicine is understanding the properties of healthier ways of doing it through diet, through lifestyle, through appropriate evidence-based supplements. And so that's really a critical issue. Now, we do know, and I had a whole chapter in the book on medications because I wanted people to not be fearful of the ones they're on, but to be thoughtful about them and what to ask their doctor and what are the endpoints they're trying to achieve and have they achieved it. Because, for example, statins, a lot of statins out there for high cholesterol. We really need to understand who should be on a statin. Should it be everybody or someone who just had a heart attack where it's actually really been shown to be quite beneficial in terms of secondary prevention? Not everyone needs to be on a statin because their LDL cholesterol is 10 above normal, 20 above normal, 30 above normal. Why not start with other mechanisms? But statins, they're designed to study one endpoint, which is lowering LDL cholesterol. We now know their ripple effect secondary problem is that they raise risk for diabetes. They raise hemoglobin A1C. They increase risk for insulin resistance, and they're also associated with dementia and early onset of brain effects. So now you have a drug that's used for one thing and does a great job at it, has results, but now you're trading it off for the potential risk of other things downstream. Okay, so that's one section we talk about statins. And then we talk about, I talk about drugs that are used for cancers that can often, which cancer, obviously you're not going to mess with that, but you really want to know what they also have side effect issues for rheumatologic components. Why is that? It's because of the way these drugs are designed. I'm not telling people not to take cancer meds. I just want people to know. We talked about proton pump inhibitors, which are like omeprazole, Nexium, designed to change the the pH of the gut. Well, we've evolved for millions of years to have very specific pH of different portions of the gut. And when you mess with that, you change your ability to extract nutrients from foods that require a low pH. And proton pump inhibitors raise the pH. So it stops the acid production, but we need that acid production to get nutrients from foods. So again, there are known deficiencies, B12, magnesium in proton pump inhibitor patients. So you want to see, is there any other way to handle reflux? Sure. Go to bed without food in your belly. Choose foods more wisely instead of fried foods and processed foods and spicy foods. Change your coffee intake, which can really irritate and cause gastritis. Manage stress, which affects the pH level and the risk for reflux. And then there are a host of really well-vetted supplements that just cool the gut and soothe the gut. So again, I wanted people to understand the pros and cons of some very common medications and then think about alternatives and really have a discussion with someone they trust in their healthcare world to see whether or not they can do it another way. That is it. So that's really my answer to that, is just be judicious about medications because they do have their own risks involved. And why not try the less is more approach just by putting a little work into the lifestyle and supplement aspect.
What actions can I take to protect myself from chemicals in my food and nutrition?
So this is a really good topic, and we talk about it a lot in the book. There's a chapter on detox that I want people to think about. It's not just getting, coffee enemas. I don't talk about that kind of stuff. I don't talk about, 30-day fasts. I really, really try to keep this as sane and evidence-based as possible because I want people to understand nutrient deficiency. I'm going to talk about nutrient deficiency. The fact that in modern day living, we're not getting the nutrients at the amounts and consistency and regularity and quantity that we require through evolution is because our food system is so poor that even if you say go all vegan or vegetarian and you have great plants that are organic, lots of good produce and fruit and that are organic, they may have traveled 6 months to get to your local supermarket. They may have been grown in nutrient deficient soil. They may be sitting in the supermarket for 5 days and then in your house for a couple of days, and by then the nutrient value has dropped. How do you measure all that? You can't. So what I want people to think about is where can we get the highest yield nutrient value from our food? And often it's frozen organics, even in plastic bags, which is not our choice. But frozen organic foods often are flash frozen and they actually maintain a high nutrient level. And being nutrient sufficient, as I coin it, I haven't seen it out there, but I'm coining it as nutrient sufficiency, has been shown to decrease the harmful effects of many common everyday chemicals, endocrine disruptors that get into our body. And I put all those studies in the book, and I want people to think about things like B9 or folic acid, and how that's been shown in mouse studies to decrease epigenetic changes in our genes from exposures to methylmercury, to phthalates, to PM 2.5 air pollution. Having enough iron and vitamin C has been shown in children to help reduce exposures to lead. So we have a lot of information about the fact that we are nutrient deficient as a population, myself included, and that not only do you need the healthy foods and clean drinking water, but you need sometimes to even add in certain supplements, which I'm not going to go into because they're very specific, but we really do need some very basic nutrients on a regular basis, including a multivitamin, but it has to be a good one, a clean one, vetted, third-party tested, has to be a company that really prides itself in outsourcing that third-party testing. And it has no colors and fillers and preservatives and all the junk that typically goes into your typical multi. But that's the kind of thing I like to talk about with patients is how do you take stuff out? And then how do you put the right nutrients in that arm you for the exposures that we're always going to be exposed to just living in modern day society.
What actions can I take to protect myself from chemicals in the outdoor air?
Yeah, so outdoor air, as I mentioned, I think in a previous clip, we have both indoor and outdoor air discussion in here because they are two different things. And, indoor air, you have much more control over in most of the time. At work, if you're working in a building that's owned by someone else, you might have cleaning crew. I don't have a cleaning crew that uses anything but the stuff I supply. I don't let them spray pesticides. I'm at my office now outside my door. I don't want it anywhere near the space that I rent. Whether that really ultimately makes a difference in any way, who knows, but it's a very simple ask, not a big deal. But essentially you can only control so much in indoor, but work at it. And then you really, outdoor air is mostly about, are you a commuter? Can you put in an air filter in your car, which are not costly, that go right into your AC adapter for a trip to and from, the city. My husband used to go to long distances into cities, and I would take an alcohol swab across his forehead, and it would be like nasty, dirty, because, you collect this stuff as you move through the world. And, it's really eye-opening. And I think I saw that more when he commuted to places that were more polluted than local places where we live, where there's a lot more greenery and the air seems to be better. But, again, this is not an evidence-based study, but I just want people to think about, and we list a lot of really practical ways to try to control what you can control, but also think about ways to manage outdoor air. We also have, certain apps that are well vetted for ozone layer, ozone rating, and whether or not you have to really think about the timing of going outside. If your kid has asthma, if you have COPD or emphysema or reactive airway, or if you have multiple chemical sensitivity to chemicals in general, we want people to be armed when they walk out the door to know, based on certain apps that are vetted, what their air quality is, what's the rating, should they be out during these hours, should they be limiting hours, that kind of thing.
What can you tell us about chemicals and COVID-19?
So this is a really interesting topic. And at the beginning of COVID, say March and February, March of 2020, I started talking with my co-author, Fred Vom Saal, who is so brilliant. And we started to discuss this topic because what we know, and this is before COVID, is that environmental chemicals affect your immune system and raise inflammatory markers. Okay. The immune system is remarkably complex. There's two systems, there's old and new, there's, they talk to each other, the humoral, and innate and humoral immune systems. It's just really remarkable. I'm trying to get to the page that I wanted to show people. 1 second here. Yeah. So I'm sorry, the adaptive and the humoral, which are basically old and new kind of systems. And, we kind of go into it here a little bit because I wanted people to have the most very basic understanding of how complex in a way the immune system is. We know that chemicals, many of them, including BPA, which is probably the most well-studied of the endocrine disruptors, has enormous effects on the immune system. In fact, we put that important study in as well. There's many, but they're the one that's really telling. And so we know that when people are exposed to so many chemicals, that they're in our bloodstream, they're in our breast milk, they're in our urine. These are tested, cord blood of newborns has upwards of 200 chemicals, believe it or not, in cord blood at birth. So we're kind of born polluted, which is a sad story, but true, even with mom's best efforts, honestly. So we know that these chemicals actually on their own raise inflammatory markers. If you pair that and you start with a baseline level of inflammation, technically, from processed foods and chemicals and stress and makeup and blah, 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 and then you add this insult, such as COVID, which certainly favors, in terms of poor outcomes, those with comorbid conditions that are caused by chemicals like diabetes, insulin resistance, heart disease, autoimmune disease, those comorbid conditions we hear about. That is connected to this inflammatory exposure, endocrine disruptors. So you have these exposures over time, your primed immune system, these comorbid conditions, and of course, now we know worse outcomes when exposed to COVID-19. COVID-19 will not be the last of our exposures that are infectious. It's unfortunate, and we've kind of been hearing this. We're at a new time now where we're going to get more infectious exposures. We're also getting more exposures to Lyme disease, which is not even seasonal anymore. As climate change is changing us, we're seeing more of these things affecting human population. But the long answer to your short question is environmental chemicals increase inflammation. Inflammation does lead to the persistence risk of comorbid conditions. We know that. And that those comorbid conditions, in fact, do raise the risk for worse outcomes when exposed to COVID. So again, it argues for cleaning up your diet, cleaning up your water, cleaning up your cosmetics, figuring out your home environment, surveying your area that you live and breathe in, your kids and your dog and your cat live in, and really doing the best you can to get yourself in fighting shape, get your nutrition up, get better sleep, manage stress, because these are anthropologically appropriate behaviors and lifestyle changes.
Can you tell us more about BPA, where it's found, what impact it has on my health?
Yeah, BPA is my co-author's bailiwick. This is his worldwide research. But I will tell you, having worked with him, but also having read the plethora, the magnitude of international data on bisphenol A. Bisphenol A is just one compound of the bisphenols. BPA got a lot of attention, as we mentioned earlier, when it was removed from baby bottles because the data was so robust in the US. And by the way, we've only removed 5 chemicals in the US since 1976, literally. Europe has removed upwards of 1,300 at this point. So we're seeing now that even it's a bad chemical and has plenty of data. Lead, we now know, went from being toxic at this level to toxic at this level to toxic at this level. And now we know it's toxic at any level, right? But bisphenol A, BPA, is so well studied that we now have enormous amounts of information on its risk for infertility, for its risk for developmental issues in newborns, for changing the genitalia in males because it can block androgens during in utero development of male and females. It can have dimorphic brain changes in terms of the brain being female or male. People don't realize that that's actually a separate developmental process. We know that BPA affects insulin resistance. It increases, it raises blood pressure. We know that it can affect thyroid conditions, thyroid function. We know that BPA can affect hormone-sensitive cancers, breast, prostate, uterine, endometrial, thyroid cancers. We know that it can cause preterm delivery. It affects birthing. We know that it can affect bone development and osteoporosis because that's another hormone-sensitive issue. It affects insulin, which is a hormone. It affects autoimmune disease risk. So you can imagine it's a pretty toxic stuff, but in fact, we've only removed it from baby bottles, thank God, but it should be out of a lot of other products. It's the most produced industrial chemical, I believe, worldwide. That being said, the way we can remove it is by looking at where we get it from most. Mostly it's ingestion. So there was great Harvard studies that they've done, a lot of studies, but one Harvard study actually switched out canned soup, or added canned soup versus homemade soup to participants, 75 participants, and then they did a washout, and they found that just the canned soup, and it was Progresso that they actually openly used in the study, just changing out a canned soup intake at lunch to a homemade, no packaging, freshly made soup reduced BPA exposures in those 75 participants by 1,100%. BPA has a 6-hour half-life. 50% is lost every 6 to 8 hours. So over the course of a couple of days, you can wash that exposure out. The problem is we're getting exposed by BPA all the time, so it never really lowers. But one of the key ways to lower BPA, which is very, very measurable, and I've done this for my own body and for some patients, is that you just stop canned foods if you're able to, and you substitute in frozens or fresh. So just the food packaging is really key. And so that's the number one way to reduce BPA, in my opinion. But it's also in products like nail polish, shampoos, conditioners, hairspray actually has BPA, which makes it stiff. and soft and stiff at the same time. So there's a lot of different ways you can get rid of BPA, but the number one way is ingestion, and that can be doable by anybody because its half-life and its property happens to be reasonable to work with.
What are microplastics? Where are they from? And what impact do they have on creating disease?
Yeah, so microplastics are really an interesting topic. I talk about this, by the way, I haven't mentioned this yet, on my platform on social media called The Smart Human, thesmarthuman.com, but also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, now Clubhouse, probably TikTok soon. Oh my God, my head is spinning. And then, of course, I have a podcast called The Smart Human Podcast that I hope people will tune into because I speak with some really interesting doctors and environmental health specialists and lawyers, and it's kind of really kind of cool. But anyway, you asked me about microplastics. So microplastics are basically what it sounds like. So very, very small, teeny tiny pieces of plastic, so small that you can barely see them. And in many cases, you can't see them. And I can't remember the micron size, but they're pretty darn small. Anyway, we get microplastics in many ways into our bodies because we consume foods with them. We are in oceans that have, they break down, plastics in our oceans break down to microplastics through sun exposure, through wear and tear of the ocean, through any mechanism you can imagine, but they break down over time because, again, plastics don't have a strong enough matrix. And so that's how they break down and get into our bodies. And then they get into fish, and they get into our seafood and the food we eat, and many countries rely on. And they get into the muscle tissue of fish and seafood and shellfish. And then we consume them. Now, we're not really quite sure. I don't think the studies are really fully out to show what that means to human health, because, again, it's association, not causation for many things. But it can't be good to have plastics in our body. It's not anthropologically appropriate. It's in beer. I did a whole, if you like to drink alcohol, I have a whole section on alcohol where I talk about chemicals in alcohol, what to look for and how to avoid it, and some of the brewery rules in Europe versus US. And it's been found in honey, it's been found in beer, it's been found in drinking water, certainly, especially tap water that's made into bottled water. So we are getting exposed a lot from just the food and drink industry. And then we do it from our food, seafood. And really the question is, why do we do this? Also, another interesting thing, I did a whole thing about coffee and tea. We get it from tea bags. When you heat up non-organic tea, non-organic coffee, you're releasing all those chemicals, manufacturing, pesticides into that hot, healthy cup of green tea or whatever you choose, but you're also getting microplastics. And this has been tested, and I post on this on The Smart Human, among other topics. And that was actually a particular post that got a lot of attention because it's a well-done study. And in fact, those tea bags are made often, not always, but often from plastics like rayon, very soft, like similar to a pantyhose or stockings. So we want to really think about what we heat to high temperatures and then ingest, thinking it's healthy for us, but we really want to break it down to make it healthiest. And we do that. It's not hard to do.
What are potential long-term impacts of cumulative exposure to contaminants and hazardous materials? What's the difference in impact between a single exposure event and multiple exposure events over a longer period of time? And please describe the process of how a material can be considered safe in a single use and then not safe after a repeated number of uses.
Yeah, I think the big question here is, why do some people get sick and some people don't? In general, it's exposomics. It's how the exposome or our genetics respond to, not just our genes that we, are born with, but also what does our lifestyle do to affect whether diseases get expressed or not? And what do foods and exposures, even if they're, once or 1,000 times, do to our risk for disease? And really what it comes down to is, what we now know is, you're born with your genes, just like, you can't necessarily change your actual gene structure on your own. Just like you can't change your in-laws, just kidding. But what happens is lifestyle, diet, nutrition, smoking, sun exposure, stress, light, sleep, Lifestyle affects the proteins that are in our genes that allow those genes for a disease to be expressed or not. That's called your exposome. And we go into that in the book very clearly to understand that. So what we do have control is what affects our proteins that are like the stops or the plugs that either let those genes get expressed or stay quiet. So you're not always going to get Alzheimer's if your family has Alzheimer's. You're not always going to necessarily get cancer if you have family members with cancer risk. Unless it's genetic, that's a whole nother discussion of BRCA genes and genetic component. Genetic component with breast cancer, for instance, is 10%. It's pretty strong, but 90% is environmental. A lot of people don't know that statistic. It's well known now. 90% of people who get breast cancer has an environmental component that can be worked with. And so that's the idea, is we can control our lifestyle, our exposures to some degree, chemicals, if we can do that. But we can't always control our actual genetic makeup. It's just the components, the proteins that allow them to be expressed. Our development of disease is a dance between three things: genetics, lifestyle, and exposures. And what we can control, it's not our genetics necessarily, but our lifestyle and our exposures is what I'm trying to teach and what the literature supports. So that's really what I say, is that, just because you get gene tested and you have a gene for Alzheimer's or you have a gene for something doesn't mean it's going to be expressed. And you can actually work pretty easily to remove some of those exposures. And again, low levels over time. Endocrine disruptors are infinitesimally small. Parts per million, parts per trillion, but it's these low-level exposures over time that increase risk. And because they're like hormones, they work at very tiny levels to create a lot of change. So they have this kind of an exponential physiologic effects. So again, reducing is all we got, but it's not hard to do. So why not do it?
What chemicals, you've mentioned chemicals in our food. Which foods are they in, and are we protected if we eat organic?
That's a great question. So, most people would agree. I mean, most common sense would say the processed foods, fast foods, processed foods that are packaged, they tend to have many more chemicals, right? Because they have to be shelf stable, they have to have preservatives. If you look at an ingredient label, which, by the way, in the book, in the food chapter, I give all sorts of hacks to how to read a label. I mean, the labels are confusing as well. But when you know that the first ingredient is the most quantity in that product per serving versus the last thing on that ingredient list, that's important to understand. To look and see which ones are preservatives is important to understand produce, and understanding the label in produce in supermarkets will tell you if it's organic or not, just with the numbers. And I want to teach people that as well. So the idea is that if you have the ability to suss out labels and marketing through packaging, you are really well ahead of the game, because you can make much better decisions based on knowing the industry and how it works. Organic is phenomenal. I do recommend, as much as people can afford it, have access to it. Organic is the only regulation in the US that has any teeth when it comes to our food in terms of safety or risk. It does allow certain pesticides, but they're really low on the list in terms of harm, and they're far fewer that are allowable in the general market. So getting organics that are frozen are far cheaper than even organic fresh. Buying organic produce in season makes it cheaper. And yes, you are removing a whole host of pesticides, genetically modified ingredients, which is a whole nother topic. So yes, I do recommend organic. I don't always get organic for certain products. Like Environmental Working Group has a Dirty Dozen Clean 15 list, which is in the book, 2020's list. They look at produce across the country and they measure pesticide residues of non-organic produce, and see which ones tend to have the most residues versus not. It's always strawberries and apples are almost always the bad guys every year. But you can look into that, and you can choose things that are not organic, like asparagus is often low in that list for the clean 15. And so again, having these tools available will help you decide if you need to get organic or not. If it's a watermelon and a cantaloupe with the skin and a shell, perhaps that's even a better choice than berries or peaches that absorb chemicals from their skin quite readily, and that's what you're eating. So again, we walk through all of that in this book, but I understand cost issues and access. This is a real big issue. So if you, now big box stores are actually having their own organic line, so I encourage that. So definitely go with big box stores that are now doing it themselves because they know it's lucrative and they know people want it.
What detoxifications methods work to get chemicals out of our body? Should we take infrared saunas?
Great question. So the infrared sauna issue, I think, is a separate one because I actually don't push infrared. I push regular saunas because regular saunas are more anthropologic. And because we were designed as human creatures to sweat, whether we're doing it through exercise or like my patients, many of whom cannot physically exercise because of arthritis and autoimmune issues. And I recommend sauna, a regular thermal sauna, if they have access and if it's not a pandemic. But the idea is that infrared, generally considered safe, and certainly we put a whole section in the book about that, but really more about the fact that there's some risk potentially of skin cancers because of the level of radiation going through the layers of the skin to deeper levels. Again, I'm not saying that happens. There's not enough studies to really conclude that, but it's just something that makes me think, well, is this anthropologic? Did we really have infrared saunas 2.5 million years ago? Or did we just run around chasing chickens and looking for berries and nuts and sweat? So I look at the sweat studies that are really quite interesting. But again, certain foods, I mean, it's not just detoxing by removal, which is the number one easiest way to get chemicals out of your life, is just removing stuff, air quality, air fresheners and this and that, whatever. Second thing is eating foods that are clean, so you're not constantly re-upping all those chemicals in your body. Getting clean filtered water, so you're not adding those chemicals again to your body. Removing chlorine from your drinking water, so it doesn't remove the good bacteria or kill off the good bacteria in our gut. People don't realize that medications and certain foods and certain chemicals actually wipe out the good bacteria in the gut microbiome, which we need for our immune system to be healthy. So there's this big kind of cycle of where do you start first? Start easily, start with basic stuff. But I would say detoxing is also choosing the right foods, not just any clean foods, but even like cruciferous vegetables. I gave a whole list of all of the pre and probiotics, that are easy to buy in supermarkets and access, but also cruciferous vegetables list, because I don't even cook most of the time. And I only know of like broccoli and, Brussels sprouts. Believe it or not, there's like 30 other cruciferous vegetables that if you dare to try, they're delicious. And they have these great detoxing capabilities through chemicals like indole-3-carbinol and sulforaphane, glucosinolates and all those fancy words. So I do encourage people to hit the cruciferous vegetables that are pesticide free pretty hard. And we give a lot of great selections for those.
When you say in your book, medications are chemicals too, what did you mean?
I'm going to take a swig first. So, and by the way, I'm not going to give a brand. Stainless steel, no plastic lid, I should say lip, so you don't drink out of a hot plastic flip top straw. This keeps my tea hot for 8 hours. So, lots of good stuff out there. I don't recommend particular brands, but they're easy to find. You want American made if you can find it. So what was the question?
What detoxifications? Oh, I'm sorry. When you say in your book, medications are chemicals, what did you mean?
Yeah, sorry, medication. So we kind of went through that a little bit, but I wanted people to have something that most consumers in medicine don't always think about, because you're in a system that you didn't train for. You're trusting physicians that you assume are well-trained and have your best interests in mind. And so I want people to think about, how do you challenge your healthcare doctor or whoever your healthcare provider is in a way that's not combative, it's not causing trouble, but truly wants to know, you want to know, why are you on something? What does it do? How does it work? What is the endpoint goal? Can it be lowered? What are the criteria for getting off that medicine if it's a possibility? I'm not saying all meds can and should be off, but I think it's a way of saying, I'm putting this thing in my body. I should know what's in it. And I should know if there's any risk. And I should know maybe if there's an alternative to it. It's really just asking questions. So I really wanted to put in that chapter a list of great questions for any practitioner that I don't think are aggressive or offensive, and they're really just logical. I wanted people to understand that medicines, again, are not just, they are chemicals. They are coated in phthalates often. They're made with colors and chemicals. They're, time released is, time released because there is certain chemicals coating it that have little holes in it. So it's not to create paranoia, but it's to know that the way chemicals, even aspirin, even things that we consider pretty benign, the way they're designed and way they're manufactured actually adds chemicals. So if you don't have to be on them and there's other ways to do it and you're willing to do a little work about it, I think that's worth exploring. If you're not, that's okay too.
We've talked a bit about this. Can you tell us the exact main chemicals we should be concerned about?
Too many to count. There's 90,000, and the most well-studied, I'll give you a list of some really well-studied ones: parabens, sulfites. Many are on shampoo bottles or whatever, cosmetics trying to tell you they don't have them in there. That's not regulated, by the way. So you can actually market that and not even do a thing about your ingredients. I mean, there's no law regulating testing of cosmetics. You're really trusting the brand. But really, there are groups of chemicals that we've been taught that are really bad for us. Certainly heavy metals. Some of them we need copper. We need certain components, iron in our body, right? But there are metals that are not so good for us, or at least in too much quantity. So let's be real on that. But, really I want people to, and we do break it down. I will say this, we do have the cosmetics chapter does talk about groups of things to look for and teaches you how on a cosmetic label, even shampoo, conditioner, body spray, what to be thinking of, what to be looking for. But there really are so many that I don't want to overwhelm people and even on a day-to-day basis, your exposures change. If you have a good day versus a bad day, if those chemicals have a half-life that's shorter than others, they may linger, they may not. So really, it's really hard to say anyone is a bad guy, but we have the most data on phthalates, most data as a class, bisphenols, heavy metals like mercury, methylmercury, and lead. Flame retardant chemicals, very important. We have lots of data on flame retardant chemicals from 1970s because they have changed up, but they all have been implicated in lots of health issues, including endocrine disruption. So, the ones that have been most well tested, I promote in terms of educating the most because they're examples of others.
You have a chapter in your book called Home Furnishings: How to Avoid Flame Retardants and Other Toxic Chemicals. Please tell us more about this.
Yeah, I think once you've gotten through some of the lower hanging fruit, like your water ingestion and your diet, and maybe you've cleaned out some cosmetics, I just look at that sort of later in the book as another area to conquer when you're ready. And really what it is just basically, look, if you want to buy a new couch, take a look at this label. This is going to tell you there's no flame retardant chemicals. If you can't afford a couch, like we didn't for 10 years, we had 2 couches with flame retardants that made me tick every time my kids were playing on it. But we didn't have a couple grand to just drop for new couches. Not everyone has that. But when you're ready to get rid of that couch and you're ready to get another one, I want people to have what they need to know to make those choices, better choices. And really, it's a matter of understanding labeling, understanding the industry. And so we give the backstory on all of that so that you can make those wiser decisions. Furniture, a lot of cheap furniture is made cheaply because it has a lot of really harmful industrial chemicals, a lot of which are creating VOCs or volatile organic chemicals that kind of circulate throughout the air. And we know this because when you walk into certain furniture stores, you can smell it, or when you get new furniture or a new car smell, for instance. Those are often chemicals that are industrial. They're not so great for us necessarily. We don't need them for any real reason, but they do have the potential to get into our bloodstream, just like oxygen. So they come in with the oxygen. And what I want people to realize is that when you're changing out things, do them in a smart, reasonable, cost-effective manner. And here are the tools to do so, whether it's rugs, whether it's, furniture, whether it's flooring, even cookware. We can do this. You just don't want to do it in a way that overwhelms you. And that's how this book was designed.
Does sleep play an important role in detoxing our body of chemicals?
Yeah, this is cool stuff. I mean, this is why I think I love medicine. We now know from really cool international studies. I think 2013 is one of the quoted studies from China that I loved. We really have what's called this glymphatic system. You know, we've often heard of the lymphatic system that moves fluid throughout the body and helps with our immune system. But the glymphatic system is really the fluid that surrounds our brain and our spinal cord. In addition to sort of this spinal fluid. Glymphatic system is the concept that we are able to move chemicals that we're exposed to on a daily or weekly or monthly basis from around our brain and kind of get rid of it while we sleep. And there's now cool studies that show that we actually, in fact, not only need sleep for rest and cognition and memory and to feel good, but we need good quality sleep because it helps remove the chemicals of exposure on a regular basis. So I did talk about that, and I do love that topic.
What do you say to a patient that was exposed to chemicals and toxic materials, and what do you recommend they do?
Not panic, not freak out. I can't tell you what I think about when I think about the college mattress I slept on for basically 4 years. You know, there are things you cannot change. Exposures you didn't know about, you know, people with children that have illnesses or themselves that have illnesses that you didn't know better. You didn't know better, no regrets. You just have to keep moving forward. I say that about my own life and my own self and my family and my own family's health. We have to keep just moving forward, make changes that are appropriate and reasonable and cost effective for yourself. But when you know better, you do better. Is that Maya Angelou? I don't know. But anyway, that's a really important quote. And I think that what people need to first think about in terms of even environmental health questionnaire in their brain is, how can I get rid of it? Where was I exposed? You know, how much time was I spending around it? Can I remove it? If it's mold in your house, I just had a patient yesterday with exposures to a variety of chemicals that might be mold. She's looking for a new home. These are big decisions. If you have amalgams in your mouth, you know, that you had for 40 years, and there's a question of whether they may be contributing to your symptoms. And then again, that's a difficult question. You want to explore that in a way that doesn't freak you out and spend 50 grand on removal in 24 hours, you know, because really panic and fear are not your best friends when we've been exposed to these chemicals for a long time. So do them in a reasonable way so that you can actually peel away stuff and see whether it makes a clinical benefit to your body.
What nutritional supplements do you recommend everyone take? Are there any that pull bad things out of our body? How about chlorella for removing heavy metals?
Yeah, I mean, there's the whole world of binders, right? You know, things that actually grab metals or grab toxins. You know, the interesting thing about some of the, and I think this is an interesting area. I don't think I'm well versed enough in it. There's so much more to learn. But, you know, when you bind metals, for instance, or you do, what's it called? Clay and some of these, you know, binders, they remove many of the good metals too. Again, these products can't always decipher between what your body needs, like iron and copper metals, but they, you know, you're trying to get to a specific, it's kind of like antibiotics. We kind of throw them to get rid of a particular bad thing like salmonella or, you know, chlamydia or something of that sort, but we're not realizing that it wipes out the good guys too, that may be balancing those and keeping them quiet. So, you know, again, medicine is very imprecise. I don't care who you ask. It is an imprecise science. It is a lot of trial and error. Medicines are helpful, supplements are helpful, but diet and nutrition, I think, are the most reliable to some degree. Even there are issues with food sensitivities that can be tested and weeded out. But in terms of appropriate supplements, I look at it as nutrient sufficiency and what should we have as anthropologic evolved human beings. What are we missing in modern day diets? What are we not getting on a regular basis? And how do we just get a low level of exposure to those components in a way that's not costly and makes sense? So I do recommend certain supplements on a daily basis, but very limited and limited, also personalized to the person's own testing that's reasonable to test. I do a lot of nutritional testing that's covered by Quest and LabCorp. I don't think people need to spend a fortune with outside labs necessarily to get the same information that I think is very well done at some of these insurance paid for labs. And so I start there and then we go from there. I think if you test too much, you find out too much you can't explain. So you have to do it in a way that makes sense. So yes, supplements, I'm not going to go into all of them. I think it's not appropriate as a doctor to tell anyone that right away, because there are nuances to supplements. There are some supplements people should not be on, even though they're commercialized and everywhere. So I leave that to specific consults, but definitely consider, a multivitamin is not something out of this world. Certainly getting vitamin D levels, not up to normal, but high normal or normal, an elevated D level is really helpful with COVID. We know that too, in terms of the immune system. Certainly thinking about foods that are probiotic and prebiotic, as well as perhaps even a supplement by a vetted, good quality probiotic maker. And that's important to know. Some things like fish oil or turmeric, and there's hundreds, ginger and garlic. And there's just so many that you can get laden, but it really should be as much specialized to you as you can possibly find out.
Should everyone wear organic undergarments?
Ooh, I'm in trouble if that's the case. It's really hard. Organic undergarments. My goodness, that's an interesting one. In this day and age, you can find organic cotton made products. For a while, for Target, I think had organic sheets, and I don't know why they're not there. I think it's some of them now, but you can find products that use organic cotton, and I'm all for it. Or organic wool or something non-synthetic. That's a wonderful thing. It does often cost more. I'm sure organic bedding is very costly. I've looked into it. But I also think that, as consumers and people who may not have that kind of funds, you pick the low hanging fruit and work in that direction. I do think a mattress is quite important. We changed out our mattress that was made of foam that was 20 years old that I was sure had flame retardant chemicals. That was one of the greatest moments in my life. As I sleep face planted, I really couldn't sleep most nights because I kept on thinking I was breathing in flame retardants with every breath. So that was a big deal for me. And you can do that now, get a pretty reasonable mattress. But I think, working through the low hanging fruit, organic fabrics are fantastic. They probably utilize less important natural resources. They probably don't have dyes and colors that wash off in our wash, and microplastics that end up like polyester and all our fleece jackets. They're known to drop microplastics genes, been found in bodies of water around the world. We know that. So if you want to do something for the planet, especially, I would say try to go with more natural fibers. They're easy to take care of, less dry cleaning and all that. But we talk about that in the book, and we wanted people to understand textiles as well and that industry and what to think about. So the answer is yes, if you can afford it. Yes, if it's on your priority list. Yes, if you worked through all the low hanging fruit. Why not?
Should women think before using regular feminine protection products?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I talk about this a lot with my high school students and college students, because I think women, I think the society in general doesn't realize how many chemicals are in feminine care products, particularly tampons and pads. And we use them throughout the women's, reproductive cycle, at a very young ages now, because of course, the age onset of puberty is much lower or younger in boys and girls. And we know that's related to endocrine disruption chemical exposure. That's been well studied. So whereas 2 centuries ago, 3 centuries ago, we had periods that began in young girls at 16, 17, 15. Now it's as young as 7, 8, 9, particularly in the African American population of young girls, because their products generally have more endocrine disrupting chemicals in them, including placenta for hair relaxers. So we talk about this in the book, and I do encourage sharing this with young people, giving it as a gift for college. This is really a big area for me. And so, the question with feminine care products is really, when we think about what we put on, in and around our bodies, we don't really think about the vaginal canal. We don't think about tampons, but tampons are often made with rayon, cheap plastics, or cotton that is actually not organic. So it has all the pesticides and chlorinated chemicals to make it so clean and white. It also has antimicrobial chemicals like triclosan and some of the similar chemicals that are antimicrobial, which are endocrine disruptors, believe it or not, all the antimicrobials. And also the plastic applicators, which, by the way, are considered medical grade waste. So they'll never get recycled. Can you imagine, women out there who know tampons, how many plastic applicators are clogging this world up? So when you think feminine care products, go with organic, well-vetted, brands that also don't use plastic in their applicators in any component of those products. And I think you'll find that it feels better to even share that information. Even if you're a dad, share it with your kids, because this is an area that doesn't cost a lot more money. It's really not anymore. And it's just a matter of awareness.
How do you clean fruits and vegetables?
So, if you're busy and you're on the go, I tend to just buy organic because I'm so lazy and I'm busy. I shouldn't say lazy, I'm just really busy. But what I would say is that what you do is you keep white vinegar, a jug of white vinegar by your sink, or you keep a container of baking soda and you get a pot and just pour that, produce in, and you agitate and soak warm water, warm, clean, filtered water if you can do it, with baking soda for a while, or you could use white vinegar. But either way, you'll be amazed at some of the discoloration of the water, which is kind of interesting with the white vinegar because baking soda makes it a little cloudy, but you can see that there is some stuff coming off. There's also these commercial cleaners. I'm not, I don't know how good they are. I don't know if there's other junk in there because it could be all marketing nonsense. But using just those two simple ingredients has done wonderful things. Again, pesticides can be part of the whole fruit itself, the whole produce, but I'm starting with low-hanging fruit. Start with things that you can do that are cost effective and not too stressful.
Which fruits and vegetables are the best and worst when it comes to pesticides?
Well, I defer to the EWG lists. I would argue, and we have it in the book, I'll hold it up again in case this is a different segment clip. But we did manage to squeeze the 2020 list in right before printing, which was really wonderful, with permission. And basically it gives the dirty dozen, clean 15. So the dirty dozen is the top 12 conventionally, which means non-organic produce, which means your average produce, that they've tested across the US in supermarkets and different places, versus the 15, the clean 15, and has the least amount of pesticides that they found on the skin and surface of those produce. And so when you can't get a hold of organics, either frozen or fresh or what have you, you can use that list to kind of guide, which fruits and vegetables that you can use or want to use that are not organic. That being said, common sense would say that probably anything with the skin is something you would avoid if it's conventional, because that's where all of the pesticides live. So peaches, berries, they're usually high. Apples. It turns out spinach is very high in pesticide residues. Kale, which is crazy because people eat kale salads thinking they're doing this wonderful detox. In fact, their kale is loaded with residues. So you want to really think about that. The ironies that we live with. I even put in a whole section on travel and the gym, because there are ironies that I found traveling and also in my local gym that just made me question, some of our accepted behaviors. And so I wanted people to kind of walk through my world and see what I see.
Why was it important for you to come speak here at the Real Truth About Health conference?
Well, first of all, I think it's a wonderful conference, and I didn't know much about it. And actually, someone from the Smart Human Facebook community that follows me really promoted that, your program. And I felt to myself that not only is it a wonderful venue with really smart speakers and for the most part, and really interesting people with good information to share, but it's an opportunity, and I'm always looking for opportunities to share this information. I'm an educator at heart. I don't sell anything or talk about brands or endorse any companies because I want my material to get into schools nationally, unbiased. And so I'm always looking for any opportunity to share this information with communities of any kind. So, it was important for me, given the popularity, the following, this wonderful program that was started that, that I take part, and I'm happy to do so. So it's been a pleasure, and it's been really exciting to be part of it, and it's well done. And so I'm blessed. I'm pleased to have a great venue to really share this great information, I think.
Well, we feel blessed and privileged to have you with us, and we're very grateful for that and for all of your very meaningful work, and especially for all of your time here today. So thank you very, very much, Dr. Cohen.
Thank you so much. And please, folks, follow if you can, if you want bits and pieces of environmental health and disease prevention, entertaining information. I post on Facebook Monday, Wednesday, Friday, routinely, unless there's breaking news, which I do like to share in the markets. Fridays are mental health Fridays. So usually something fun, a video, something that really means something to people's mental health. Mondays are usually about sustainability, oceans, environment, how that links to human health. And then Wednesdays are usually something physiologic, nutrition, diet, exercise, chemicals, how to avoid them, all what to do. And the podcast, which just started, has really interesting people that I hope people will check out. So please follow. Please, talk this book up, share it wherever you can. It's not expensive. I'm not doing it for the money. I want it to get out there. It took a long time to write it. And Dr. Ramsal and I are very proud of what we created. So we hope people enjoy it and get some benefit from it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Be well.